Okay,
That's how you
folks,
met the.
we need to start class because
Got a lot to cover.
I'm doing the first part, Paul's doing the second part. We want to get to the whole thing this
Let's do
time.
it. Here we go.
And
9:16. We're in good
We'll
good
see.
shape.
We're on chapter 18.
Okay.
And so what we're going to do is start. And I wanted to give you we're basically covering the root facts for chapter 18 out of the power of the prophetic, which is this book, which is the earlier book that Dempsey wrote. And so we're going to cover the dispensations of time because that came up last week and I wanted to clarify just a little bit on that. And then we're going to go into the book of Abraham, and then we're going to turn it over to Apostle Paul to talk about Joseph Smith. Was he like Old Testament prophets or not?
Oh, man.
So here we go. I covered this slide last week, but I wanted to simply focus in on the latter day dispensationalism, and that it talks about preordained dispensations of time. And at the time, I couldn't remember what I was brought up and taught, and I still can't find RLDS dispensations of time, but I did find LDS ones, and I imagine that they're pretty close. So I wanted to talk about that, but keep in mind that it's because of this belief in Latter-day Saint dispensationalism. My favorite word of the day.
Yeah.
That Smith changed the name of the church to the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about on that slide. And here I went to our friends, the LDSers, the Mormons, and they say dispensations are time periods in which the Lord has at least one authorized servant on the earth who bears the holy priesthood and the keys, and I added into the kingdom, which I'm sure that's what they intended, although this quote didn't say that, and who has a divine commission to dispense the gospel to the inhabitants of the earth. Okay, so that's the definition of dispensations of time. And secondly, when this occurs, the gospel is revealed anew so that people of that dispensation do not have to depend on past dispensations for knowledge of the plan of salvation. Does that make sense in terms of Joseph Smith and restoring the gospel?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It does.
Okay, so
That's interesting.
comments so far?
I'm trying to remember the names of the 7 individuals who were the head of each dispensation, and this was very much part of our LDS theology in the early 1900s. And if you go to the temple in the archives, they have these huge banners that they'll roll out for you. Maybe not now, but I've seen them where they have each of the dispensations and who the person was that was in charge.
That's what I was looking for, and I have 7 people's names here.
Okay.
So
Okay. Well, I'm
you
trying.
tell
I
me
may.
what we missed.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
may not be right. I'm just trying to
Okay.
remember.
Well,
See
if
if
there's
you
any
try.
variation,
It's like
let us
Okay.
know.
All right.
It's like a pop quiz.
But it is also RLDS history as well as LDS.
Yes, yes. And I remember seeing those banners. I remember seeing a slideshow with all the 7
Now that's
dispensations of time and all that sort of things, but I can't remember.
Banner, but
Interesting.
I don't remember us being taught that name, our
Okay.
generation. Okay.
So you have to have an authorized servant for each dispensation of time. So Adam's the first one. He opened the way of the earth. And I'm not going to clarify these because I can't. So if you want to throw in what that means, be my guest.
So this is that definition of this is the servant of the Lord that was
Yes.
kind of in
Yes.
charge of that time,
Yes.
that era.
To
That-
reveal.
The era's tour.
They
so
were
to speak.
divided into 1,000-year dispensations.
The
So
eras.
that 1,000 years. And so
Era
this
tour.
is based very much on a literal interpretation of Genesis.
Okay.
Instead of an album.
Enoch was the second one. Now again, these are the ones that the
That sounds
LDS
right.
church lists.
Okay.
Enoch was the second. Noah, he preserved a portion of mankind through the flood. He's the third.
Sure.
And by the way, last week, somebody said, maybe it was James, said, my guess is there are 7 dispensations of time.
No, Dennis said it because it was the holy number.
Okay, well,
That's a whole
Yeah.
number.
He
did
was
it.
right,
Ding.
He was right. He got it.
We're done.
Now, except that.
except that.
In the Mormon discussion of this, they talked about there being other people, servants, authorized servants or prophets, and they talked about there may have been additional dispensations of time. So they muddy the water. And maybe they muddy the water because things don't work out in 1,000-year increments.
Yeah.
So,
Not quite exact.
But Joseph created these first. Are these from Joseph
No.
Smith's writings?
no, he was a dispensationalist and picked up this from other people. It was a popular concept at that time based on the literal reading of the Bible.
Okay, got it.
Number 4 was Abraham.
Yeah.
Number 5 was
Yeah,
Moses.
Moses, I figured would be in there, but I forgot about him.
Number 6, Jesus and his disciples.
Oh, number 7.
They brought the atonement and the resurrection. And my guess is that Moses brought the law, and that's why and Abraham basically established the chosen people.
He's the father, yeah.
So,
grandfather.
Enoch, I have no idea why Enoch is there because he just fled with the city. I mean, he
But it's gonna come back. It's gonna be Zion. Remember, that was
Okay.
that was my childhood.
Well, and he lived to be,
I think that was
What,
Joseph's
1,000 years old?
addition to the 7 dispensations that he learned about.
Yeah.
He elaborated the story.
Yeah.
of Enoch.
Enoch was
Okay.
huge
Yeah.
growing up, learning
Yeah.
about Enoch.
And then, who's number 7?
It's either Nephi or Joseph.
Joseph, I went.
Joseph Smith.
Nailed it.
And when there's a reference to fullness of times,
That's a little
it's a
heady.
referral, a reference to the final
Dispensation.
dispensation. So we are supposedly in the final dispensation, which began with the revelation of the gospel to Joseph Smith. Okay,
so did,
it's the
Joseph-
restored gospel that we use in early Mormon RLDS would have referred to.
so my
All right.
question was, did Joseph Smith recognize himself as the 7 dispensational?
Oh,
I
he
believe so.
probably would have.
Oh,
I believe
okay.
so,
Yeah.
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 So those are the 7. And again, each one has to have a servant representing basically a prophet
Are you
or
right?
someone representing God in that time period.
Did you get it?
to share the gospel.
Did you go?
What's that?
Were they the same? Were they
Yeah,
the same?
that's them.
And
So
And on the big
together.
banner, it's kind of interesting because they have pictures of each of these individuals, and the first 6 are about the size of a small dinner plate, and Joseph.
There it is.
It's very big, and so I don't know, I asked,
Because he's.
I don't know, whoever was giving the tour at the time, does that mean that Joseph, or that we thought Joseph was more important than Jesus?
Yeah.
Or just because we're in the 7th dispensation, they didn't know the answer to
Good
that.
question.
Joseph Smith had a big head.
Maybe so.
Yeah. Okay, well,
No, we got that.
so then we ran through quickly the Rosetta Stone last time, and the reason it ties in is with the Book of Abraham. And by the way, the caveat or the note that I need to make again this Sunday is this is the bad news. This first part of the chapter deals with cases where Joseph Smith made prophecies and predictions that did not come true, or he did translations that were not
Oops.
accurate. And my friend Paul gets to deal with the good news. He's going to deal with the positive and what worked well, when he actually functioned as a prophet.
Yeah.
And the assumption is, remember back to the quote from Emma Smith, that Joseph was a prophet only when he spoke on behalf of the Spirit of God. Okay, that she acknowledged that he was not a prophet all the time. He was not prophetic all the time. And that's a hard thing sometimes for us who are brought up in the RLDS/Community of Christ Church to recognize. So anyhow, we're dealing with another one of the cases where we believe that Joseph took a detour. He took a detour. And it deals with the Book of Abraham. And the point that I want to make with this slide is that the Rosetta Stone, which is the background I need to give, was finally deciphered in 1822, 1824. By 1858 was the first English language article from the University of Pennsylvania that I can find that talked about the Rosetta Stone. Joseph's work was in between those two time periods, and I think it's entirely possible he did not have access to the interpretations of hieroglyphics. And so the Rosetta Stone has three. The reason it's important is it has three different sections to it. And I don't know if you can tell real clearly. The very top part is one language, then the second, in the middle, and the bottom is a third. And it has ancient Greek, which could be translated in the time of Joseph. Egyptian hieroglyphics, which were not translated until 1824, and Demotic, which is a simplified version of that, of the hieroglyphics. So the point is, from a scholastic scholarly point of view, Joseph had no access to information to translate the Book of Abraham. And here again, you can see an illustration of the hieroglyphics on the top, the Demotic in the middle, and the Greek on the bottom. And it was only in the mid-1800s that a lot of discussion on, they started realizing it was the same text, but in three different languages. So that's how they were able to use it as translated. So Dempsey says the translation was a unique combination of frontier folklore and the apocalyptic expectation to function as a revelator. In other words, Joseph felt a pressure, according to Dempsey, to be a revelator and a translator. And that's why when these papyri became available to him, along with 4 mummies in 1835, he bought them. He bought them because he was going to translate.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and Chandler, Michael Chandler, offered them to Joseph for $2,400. And of course, Joseph didn't have that much money, so he went to some of the wealthier members of the community and in Kirtland and got the funds for them. Chandler claims he inherited the scrolls and the mummies from a man by the name of Antonio Libolo. I probably slaughtered his last name, but anyhow, we'll say that's close enough. But genealogically, there's no connection between the two. So there's no real idea of the provenance of the mummies or the papyri. The translation process went from July to November 1835. It was first published in portions in the 1842 March 1st Times and Seasons. Now, the LDS Church says that he resumed translation of it in 1842. Most of what I can find says that he really completed it by 1835, but it's neither here nor there, really.
1842, not
What did I say?
1942.
That's a.
Well, you said it
Well, I didn't
correctly.
change it from last week, didn't I?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's
I
okay.
just want you to think 100 years earlier.
Yeah, we're all right.
See,
We
we're
got
paying
it.
attention.
Yes, well, that was a gotcha. That 1842 publication falls between it's post 1824 when the Rosetta Stone was translated, and it's pre that first article in English language. There are articles in French, which I suspect Joseph Smith couldn't read, even if he had access to it. So so his translation takes place between those two. And this is what he says in church history. I commenced the translation of some of the characters of hieroglyphics, and much to our joy found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another of the writings of Joseph of Egypt, etc. A more full account of which will appear in their place. And I don't know what in their place is, if that's in the times and seasons or what. As I proceed to examine or unfold them, truly can we say the Lord is beginning to reveal the abundance of peace and truth. And that's from Joseph Smith's history. It was not published until 1853, which is after his death, obviously. So here's one of 3 facsimiles that are within the book of Abraham. And if you take a look at it, it looks terribly Egyptian, which it should. On the left-hand side is Joseph Smith's translation, and on the right-hand side is the Egyptologist translation. And so I'll just point out a few things. So if you look in the red circle, or a square rather, Joseph said that was Abraham upon Pharaoh's throne. Egyptologists say that's Osiris. You look in the green rectangle, that is the king Pharaoh, who is obviously standing behind Abraham, who's on the throne in Joseph's translation. And in the Egyptian translation is Isis, the great, the god's mother.
Osiris was the god.
Yes, yes, yes.
Is Osiris male or female?
Ma'am.
It just looks like that. By the way it's drawn.
And then the third, the blue rectangle, Joseph said was Olamai. I can't even say it. I'm not a phonetic person, so I can't even say it, but it's Olimla, a slave. But the Egyptologist says that's Anubis, who's the guide of the dead, guides them through.
Anubis.
Anubis, thank you. Like I said, I never had phonics.
And they're reading those hieroglyphics that are there on that plate.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, that's a good question. I think there were hieroglyphics that accompanied this, and this is one facsimile of an illustration that supposedly was with the papyrus. Okay, so anyhow, you can see there's a very large difference between the two. So I thought you might like to know what happened with the scrolls. In 1856, they were sold by Emma and Joseph Smith III. Now, prior to that, William Smith and Lucy Mack Smith had taken them on tours. They'd given, tours or exhibits of them. Once Lucy died, then Emma and Joseph Smith III sold the mummies and the papyri in 1856. That probably tells you something about how much they valued that. Because keep in mind, she kept the inspired version of the Bible, the manuscript, and refused to turn it over to the Mormon church, even as a loan.
But I'd say how much they need money.
That too.
Yeah.
Well, that too.
Back in the day, mummies were used for medicine and stuff.
Oh,
Explain that further.
So they thought that there was something about, like, if you ground up mummies, you could get part of their wisdom or whatever. And so they would take like the wrappings and other parts of the mummies and grind them up and make them into medicine.
wow.
There was a lot of mummies that got destroyed
I
that
was gonna
way
say, that's
because
too
people
bad.
were like using them instead of preserving.
Well, I knew that unwrapping was a popular thing in the day.
It was
Unwrapping
to
parties.
get to everything, because they would use it as medicine.
Yeah, that was a party thing that they did apparently back early. And I learned that at the exhibition when they had the King Tut exhibit here, I think.
Oh, I did not know that.
That sounds like where a lot of Egyptian curses come from.
Yeah.
I mean,
Unwrap the wrong mummy.
Yeah.
Take 2 of these mummy pills and call me in the morning.
If you're able to.
That's why when we all get older, we ache so much, I guess.
Well, the material was sold to Abel Holmes. He sold it then to the St. Louis, Missouri Museum. When it closed, it was sold, the materials were sold to Joseph H. Wood for the Chicago Museum. Anybody remember anything about catastrophic?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
cow,
Oh,
Destroyed in the 1871 Great Chicago Fire. So that should be the end of it, right?
Yeah.
Or you would think.
But it wasn't.
Yeah.
I have a
Because
class.
Holmes held on to some of the material. And I didn't follow the provenance of where that part went, but basically there were 11 papyri fragments in 1947 that were sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they call them the Joseph Smith or J. Smith papyri because they're on the back of these township maps from Smith's time period. So that's why they're pretty sure that they were the basis of the Book of Abraham. That Metropolitan Museum of Art papyri included the facsimile one, which is on the right side. And there's nobody can find facsimile 2 and 3. There are 3 facsimiles of them. So the assumption is they were lost in the fire.
And I wanted to say, if anybody wants to look up Antonio Lopolo, you can Google him.
Okay.
Just as I looked it up, the mummy's medicine was used for everything from headaches to heart attacks. And
Multi-purpose.
and all sorts of things. So that's why there was a big rush on
Mummy pills.
mummies, because people were trying to cure those heart attacks.
Better to use money.
Yeah. Well, this is facsimile 2, which is much of this is from the Joseph Smith papers. So it's josephsmithpapers.org that has much of the documents and letters and things of Joseph Smith on them. It's all online. When it was translated by Egyptologists, basically they said it's the book of books of breathing, and it was meant to enable the deceased person to continue. Maybe turning this over to me just in time. I'm losing my voice. I think it's all the mummy in the air.
Mummy dust is everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, the book was accepted by the reorganization for a while, but later was not included in canon of scripture. So it was part of our church's history for a while, but then it was abandoned. Fortunately. And so here's the important thing. The teachings we have repudiated. I'm having trouble with words today. The teachings of the Book of Abraham, and these are some of the things. The literal truth of the early chapters in Genesis are included in that. In other words, the creation story, which we've talked about earlier, that the creation story doesn't mesh with what we understand from science today on the order sequence of creation. It talks about a lineal priesthood, and whereas many in Community of Christ still believe in the lineal priesthood, we don't worry about justifying it. We don't worry about making that connection, which is different than the LDS church. It taught the plurality of gods, and which is one of the reasons why there's a big difference between LDS and Community of Christ. And that plurality of gods is based on the fact that supposedly, as we go through this life, and if we live properly and follow the guidelines, that we can become as gods.
That like the Adam God theory or something?
Subservient position of blacks, they were denied priesthood. And by 1865, Joseph Smith III repudiated ban on blacks in the priesthood. And today, the Community of Christ considers the book nothing more than, according to Dempsey, speculation by its author. Okay.
So none of the Book of Abraham ended up in our Doctrine and Covenants. Is that correct?
Part of it does. Part of it is.
I thought so.
Yeah, and
Okay.
part of it also is in the inspired version of the Bible.
Okay.
Although that's probably
Good.
more the book of Moses.
Okay.
I remember right. But yeah, we have parts of it in our scripture.
Blacks were not allowed in the priesthood before.
Yeah.
22, so part of that went in there, that blacks couldn't be a priesthood.
Oh, yeah, and I know that was a big part of our world conference this last time, is when Joseph Smith changed it to say, yes, they could be in the
Yes, that
priesthood
was-
to their own
yeah.
people.
Number 3.
That was pretty revolutionary back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Just so you know, the Pearl of Great Price includes the LDS Doctrine and Covenants, the ones that they recognize, the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, and it has the writings of Joseph Smith, and it also includes I can't remember. Oh, the Articles of Faith. So that's what the book includes. If you want to take a look at it, the bookmark here is at the beginning of the Book of Abraham.
Mm.
Comments or questions?
I know my grandmother was taught from the Book of Abraham in the 40s and 50s by the high priest that taught the class. So it was still, I think, up until the time that the Metropolitan Museum got a hold of it and, provided the correct translation. There were still people in the RLDS faith that thought the Book of Abraham was important.
But Joseph Smith III did reject that blacks being inferior, not as eligible for free credit. So
Right.
at least that part of it, back in 1850s. Okay, for those people who have been Nauvoo guides and been to Kirtland, what have I missed? What have I got wrong?
I don't know. That was pretty good. I had forgotten about the mummy thing.
I didn't.
Yeah, that's the medicine part.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
stuck
forgot
with
that
you,
I
huh?
remember hearing.
Well, yeah,
Probably 'cause they made
it was lived in
mummy
the mansion house.
You lived in where?
The mansion house. One of the mummies had its own little room. in the
Oh,
mansion
I'm glad I did not know that.
house. It's the part that doesn't exist.
Oh, okay.
The part that fell down.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't exist.
It lived in the house.
There- yeah.
Lived in the-
Yeah.
Yes,
it
the
was
mummy lived.
Well-
It stayed in the mummy. It was never alive. Wasn't walked around at night.
Well, a topic for another day, although it's probably not worth studying in this class, is the salamander letter forgeries.
Yep.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
more of a modern
Yeah.
modern thing in
We
the
all
LDS
lived through
church.
that one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And there was a reference, and I'm not sure how many, supposedly there are about 11 pieces of papyri that ended up in the museum. But supposedly there's also another piece that is held by one of the bishops of the Mormon church. And I keep wondering, where did he get his piece?
Passed down.
It's been.
So it's just interesting.
It is.
Okay, any other comments or questions before I turn it over to Paul? Yeah, you want to switch?
I think I can read it from here. So the remainder of the chapter, we may or may not get to it. I don't know. We'll give it a go here. Dempsey makes comparisons between 3 of the ancient Old Testament prophets and the prophetic initiatives of Joseph Smith Jr. And I will say up front, I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but you all can see what you think about it. I think he makes some valid points, and then there are some points that I kind of got lost on, or were lost on me. The first one was the prophet Amos, and so was Joseph Smith Jr. like the prophet Amos. Let's see, am I hitting the right button here? Okay. So just a little review. Amos is one of the minor prophets. It's not a book that we read often as scripture in worship, so it may be one that we're not terribly familiar with, except for one part which we have a hymn, "Let Justice Flow Like a River," and that is not quite a direct quote, but it is a quote from something that Amos wrote about the topic of justice. He preached around the years of 766 to 755 BC. In the midst of that, somewhere around 762, there was a big earthquake that destroyed quite a bit of Palestine, Israel. And I think a lot of people felt that that was a punishment from God, coming at the time it did. And then, of course, Israel was trying to manufacture alliances with Egypt and with the Assyrians to the north to sort of keep their independence. But eventually the Assyrians did come down and conquered Israel, and many of the Jews were carried off, at least from the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, and that's the first Jewish diaspora where Jewish people, Hebrew people, were taken out into the world and never returned, to their homeland again. Amos, according to his own account in the book, was a herdsman, so a sheep herder and a keeper of fig trees. So kind of interesting to me. That's sort of a humble background, kind of consistent with other famous Old Testament writers. But Amos is one of the most beautiful books in terms of its literary value. It's extremely well written, and I think a lot of scholars believe that it was written by Amos, somebody named Amos. But how someone who comes from that humble background could write such beautiful literature is a little bit of a mystery to me. And Brother Dempsey doesn't really examine that, I don't think, but I'd like to know more about it. But Amos was described as a wisdom scholar and a charismatic philosopher. So one of the really fine books of the Bible. Got to put my glasses on to see the arrows here, Jonathan. Thank you. The basic themes from Amos, he preached against people making prayers and sacrifices, but not giving up their bad deeds. And so he would say, you do all of these things to honor God, but you continue to live lives that, are not particularly good. He was in favor of economic justice. Dempsey said he was an uncompromising monotheist. The 8th century BC was still a time when Israel was kind of divided as to whether they were going to follow the one true God of Abraham, or if they were going to embrace other gods, which were very common in the day. We've talked about and learned about some of that. He also identified the relationship of people with God as a moral contract, as a moral covenant that was very, very important, and emphasized that people should be seeking the Lord and not just maybe waiting for God to seek them out, but actively seeking to know more about God. So this is how Dempsey suggests that Amos, the prophet Amos and the prophet Joseph Smith Jr. were alike. He said that both were on a quest to become knowledgeable people. There's no doubt about that if Amos, in fact, was the Amos who was the herdsman and the keeper of the fig trees, was able to self-educate in a time when he more likely would have been illiterate, then that's a noble pursuit. And certainly Joseph Smith Jr. was very much the same way. He was not necessarily a highly educated man in terms of university education or having been taught in schools of theology or anything like that, but he was not afraid to read and to learn and to explore. And so to support that, Dempsey cites a few passages from the 85th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, where Joseph wrote in his prophetic, one of his prophetic writings, teach one another the doctrine of the kingdom. And then I'm very interested in this next one, be instructed more perfectly in theory, principle, doctrine, and law of the kingdom. How many people in 1831 or 1830 used the word theory? Now, I may have a very different understanding of the word theory because, I've got some background in theory and research, but I'm wondering, well, what was Joseph talking about here? That's a very interesting term for a relatively uneducated person to put into his writing. So what's the theory of the kingdom? So something to think about, I guess. We understand principles and doctrines and laws. I think those are pretty clear cut, but I was very interested in theory. He said we need to learn about things which have been, so probably history, past, and the things that will come to pass. Talk about things that will come to pass. So he was also not only looking backward in time, but also looking forward in time, and trying to help people to understand that it's important to understand, to anticipate where we're going. Where's the world going? Said we should know about wars and perplexities of nations, knowledge of countries and kingdoms. Very broad commandment. What do you think about that? You know, again, most people in the 1830s probably didn't have a lot of education, and yet here is the prophet, president of the church, who is admonishing people that they should learn about those things. I remember for the very short time that David Ettinger was the pastor here at Mission Road, because I followed him as pastor, and he brought a briefcase to a meeting, and he opened his briefcase, and there was a Time magazine in there. And I said, David, what's the Time magazine for? I would have thought you'd had your Bible and your Book of Mormon and your Doctrine and Covenants. And he says, well, you know, we're being taught as ministers of the church that we need to be familiar with what's going on in the world. So I subscribed to Time magazine so that I would be, you know, familiar with current events. And so this would have been about the time that Dempsey was writing, and I think there must have been an emphasis on that in the training of our appointee ministers, at which he had been an appointee minister up until that time. And then Joseph says, does somebody have a comment? Joseph says, seek wisdom out of the best book, seek learning by study and also by faith. So what does he mean by study? I get that, but what about learning by faith? And what's your definition of faith? How would that come into it? What is faith?
Believing in something you can't prove, I guess, sort of.
Okay.
Maybe not a complete definition. I think maybe when you open yourself up and allow the Spirit to work within you, sometimes you, well, I guess, discern some things. That's what I think.
Okay, that's fine. Any others?
I've always thought that scientists operate on faith. Because
Oh, no.
you make an assumption, have the faith that you can prove it, you try it, and either it happens or it doesn't. Every experiment starts with a seed of faith.
You have to have faith that it's
Actually,
going to
theory,
make a
if they
difference.
work on, they work by theory, not by faith. So they have a theory which they then test to see
Yeah,
if it works.
And theory is simply faith that things operate. Really, science is just a religion.
Whoa. Oh my gosh, you're killing Paul. You're killing him.
It shook me a little bit there too.
Well,
Jonathan said, here's this big rabbit hole, Paul, just go right down into it.
He back there was going.
Sure, these eyes are
We'll
big.
have a class on this someday. Probably not today.
I just don't-
Yeah. I understand your point of view there. I take that. I think a lot of people probably feel that. And, you know, to go along with what Jeremy's saying, scientists usually operate from what we call a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a best guess, but based on previous information, based on previous knowledge that has been well
it's a
established.
belief, right?
And theories are well-established knowledge. It's just simply an explanation of how things work. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of faith. I mean, we certainly hope that our theory will hold up, but the value of science is that if new information comes along, then we can revise the theory and make it better. So there's always this openness to new information that a good scientist should have, I think.
It's kind of like a religion where you have continuing.
I'll agree with Jonathan
Continuing
as
revelation.
far as scientists have faith that you can understand things.
So faith, I actually looked it up just because I thought, well, you know, I think I know what faith is, but I've never really examined, you know, a definition of it. Belief is the assumption that something is true in the absence of evidence. That's what belief is. Actually, it's from an ancient Saxon word, leaf, which means what we wish for, what we wish to be. Faith is a little bit different, at least based on the definitions that I found, and that has more to do with confidence in God, confidence that God can accomplish or help us accomplish certain things. So, I like that because it helps to differentiate faith from belief a little bit. You know, I can say I believe anything, but if I have faith in God, I have faith that if I do certain things, you know, God's going to keep up God's half of the covenant.
So trust.
What's that?
Trust.
Trust. Yeah, trust is a good a good synonym for faith. It's
Here again,
trust in God.
you're limited by language.
By what?
Language.
Yeah, very much so
Because
sometimes.
I think I've said this to y'all, Leo Van Campen, then, yeah. He did translation. He was Dutch. And he said in Dutch, I can't split. There's not another.
No word.
So, you know, sometimes what we believe is based on what our language yeah.
It is, that language
same.
is great, but it can be very limiting too, because it's difficult, especially when we want to describe things that have to do with the divine, with God and with the eternal. It can be very difficult to find the proper descriptives to make that clear. But back to the original question, so we're to seek wisdom by study and also by faith. So again, how now that we sort of expanded our understanding about faith, what did Joseph mean here? What do you think he was talking about?
I do think Joseph Smith's legacy for this church is that we look towards other books. We look towards these best books or good books to learn about our own faith, to learn about our own belief systems. And so I think that he kind of opened that up for me to say, okay, I do think it's important to study the Bible, but I also think it's important to study other books. And that's really made a difference for my own faith journey. So,
Well, you're hearing
Yeah.
other people's voices through those books and their thoughts. And to me, it's kind of like a whole massive critical thinking. You're getting all different perspectives.
If faith and trust are synonymous, then he made his reference may be that through study and trust in God, that's how we come to the best knowledge possible.
I know this because it was a scripture that I had to use last week to speak at Shawnee Drive, that one of the statements is God is love, that was in that scripture from 1 John. And if God is love, that kind of took me back to what we learned in the previous text that we just finished from Dempsey, that, you know, as we look at scriptures, as we're seeking to learn more about them, you know, maybe it's important to remember those criteria that he put in front of us. That is this loving? Is it just? You know, is it right? So to me, that kind of opens up the avenue to learning by faith. That if I apply my faith that God is loving, if I trust that God is loving and will lead us in a good direction, then hopefully God will help us with our understanding of all the good books that we find to read and learn from. All right, so based on what Joseph reported in section 85, Dempsey came to three conclusions: that we should be broadly informed in languages, theology, astronomy, geology, ecology, history, geography, international affairs. And the purpose of doing all of this, and I think why the church maybe was emphasizing this in the early 90s with their appointees, was that this is to prepare us for mission. We had been a church up until that point that had largely ordained elders in 70 and sent them out.
Yeah.
No preparation, you know. I mean, they had the testimonies, they had the Book of Mormon in their hand, they had, you know, what they had probably learned in listening at the preaching services, but they weren't really prepared in a way that they could minister to a very complex world and share the gospel with others who didn't have the background, you know, that they had. And so now we're talking about, you know, people should be educated. They should learn some good things. And the purpose of that is to prepare us for mission in the world. And then he says, wisdom can be an ally of faith rather than an alternative to it. And so how would this work? The questions that he addresses: what would a person who has wisdom but not faith look like? What kinds of things would they say and think? What would they lack? How about a person who has great faith, maybe not a lot of book reading? You know, how would that person be? But then how would a person be who possesses both faith and wisdom, as, some education as well as, this trust in the nature of God to lead us in the way. And you can think of examples, to yourselves, I guess, of what each of these individuals, might look like or sound like or be like.
Mormon missionaries, right out of college, so they're somewhat educated, but
Not even right out of college. I think they do their missions when they're 19, so
Yeah.
they stop
Yeah.
college and go on mission, and then come back and finish it.
like out of high school, they
I was mean to them. I kept asking them questions of history and they kept coming back. And then they brought somebody because I asked them about the Adam God theory and
You're like the tempter from Job. You're
poking them.
just poking them.
Finally, I just quit answering the door.
Jim?
Well, a month ago, I just got through reading the biography of Joseph Smith III. And there is a person with both faith and wisdom. And if you haven't read the biography of Joseph Smith III, you should do so, because he had faith and wisdom, and the best president of this church that we ever had.
And he was well educated too. He was an attorney, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
I would say I think I admire Third more than Junior.
Well, he had some background, he knew what was before.
Yeah,
I would also say that wisdom is more than just education.
yeah.
Because I do think wisdom and faith go together with that discernment process that Coral was talking about.
Well, I would say, knowledge and faith together are wisdom, but the way he's using
Yeah.
wisdom in the book,
Yeah, that's
I think
better
he's
for me.
talking about,
Yeah,
it's step beyond.
become somewhat learned,
Yeah.
don't just go out without a little bit of knowledge and expect to be able to accomplish the mission of the church. But yeah, I see what you're saying there, definitely.
I did listen to the spring, I signed up for the spring series for the Historical Foundation that they had Everett Rapio tell his story.
Mhm.
I was really impressed.
Yeah. All right, so the next prophet that Dempsey looks at in comparison with Joseph Smith Jr. was Jeremiah. And Jeremiah came about 200 years after Amos. He was a prophet of the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE. And he went through different phases in his prophetic life. In the time before Babylon conquered Judah, the southern kingdom, this was the pre-captivity period when the Jews were taken to Babylon. He was a preaching prophet who spoke against idolatry, priestly greed, and corruption, and false prophets, very similar to other Old Testament prophets who were upset that, especially the hierarchy, the priesthood of the church of the early Hebrew faith were not doing their job. And then during captivity, he emerged more as a prophet who ministered to the people and taught them how to continue to be a people of God, but in an alien land, in unusual circumstances. And then in his old age, he taught the people about their covenant with God and invited them to consider letting the covenant be something that is written in their hearts. It's actually a part of them. It's not just something that we sign on to as a statement of belief to be a Hebrew or a Jewish person, but rather that we take God into ourselves and be representatives in that way. And so the question, what did Jeremiah's example offer to the prophetic leadership of Joseph Smith? And this is probably the part that I am a little unsure of as far as my agreement with Dempsey. He suggested that Joseph was a prophet who was capable of changing and developing and evolving as the circumstances demanded. And not that I disagree with that, I disagree a little bit with what I'm about to share with you, which is the evidence that he provided that was happening. And so one of the things that he brings up was the changes in the early church regarding the law of consecration and personal ownership to the church. And this was not something that was uncommon. This was kind of all things shared equally. when people came into the restoration, they turned over the rights to their properties and their goods to the church, and then the church provided, presumably equitably, for everybody who came into the movement. And
Peter too.
what's that?
Peter, first,
Peter?
Peter the disciple.
Yeah, kind of like what they did in the ancient church after Jesus was ascended into heaven in the book of Acts, exactly like that. And so this is two examples of a revelation that he initially gave in 1833, and then a revision that he made to that. And the first one was, "And behold, thou shalt consecrate all thy properties, that which thou hast unto me with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken." So the commandment is simply to give everything to the church. And what happened in the interim between 1833 and 1835, when the church was in Kirtland, some of the families wanted to leave and they wanted to take their property back and take it with them. And Joseph said, "No, you can't do that, because this is a binding covenant, and this belongs to the church." And so those families got attorneys, and the United States government told Joseph otherwise, that he had to return the property. And so there was a revision in that section of the Doctrine and Covenants, which came as section 13. And now he's added the language, "And behold, thou wilt remember the poor." So there's a kind of a purpose for why they're doing that. "And consecrate of thy properties for their support, that which thou hast to impart unto them with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken." And then we're going to go on with this a little bit more. And then the previous edition was everything was going to be laid before the bishop when they gave up their properties and their money, and set apart for the purposes that the bishop would determine. And then he's added a little bit of language here 2 years later. "And his counselors, in addition to the bishop, 2 of the elders of the high priests, such that he has appointed for that purpose." And then we're going to go on here. "And it shall come to pass," the old one said, "the bishop of my church, after he has received the properties, shall appoint every man a steward over his own property, or that which he has received, inasmuch as is sufficient for himself and his family." And after the event where Joseph, the church was sued for the properties and had to return them, there's some more expanded language here. "And after that he has received these testimonies concerning the consecration of the properties of my church." In other words, I think what he's saying is, when people say, "Yes, this is what I want to do," they're putting it in writing here, that they cannot be taken from the church. "Every man shall be made accountable to me, a steward over his own property, or that which he has received by consecration, inasmuch as he is sufficient. As is sufficient for himself and his family." And so the Dempsey's interpretation is, the church would no longer take all of a person's property, only that which was, qualified as surplus. Now, Dempsey sees this as prophetic growth. I see this as somebody, and I'm interested in what Jane has to say about it, because this to me sounds
I
like,
think you got a lawyer. I think you got a lawyer.
I think Joseph is trying to legally protect the church from any more,
Lawsuits.
suits being brought against him. So, and I don't know, maybe Sharon has some ideas. She's got legal background too, but to me, this sounds like maybe I'm wrong, it sounds like he's making some revisions to protect himself in the future.
Well, he's acknowledging the realities of the time, which the prophets do, but here's the real situation.
Yeah.
So is that prophetic growth, or is that just common sense CYA?
Growth, it's growth. Let's just say growth.
It's growth, it's growth.
It's gaining wisdom.
But I don't take this in the same.
Talking to your lawyer before you write it.
Yeah.
I don't take this in the same
Talk to a lawyer
way
before you write
that Jeremiah grew with the times. His ministry changed out of necessity for what the people were going through. This to me seems a little different. I don't know.
Well, and I gotta tell you, wills and testaments it's a very specific kind of law.
Yeah.
Where testimony's not gonna do it, That's one thing I'm looking at that going, well, that doesn't even work.
Well, if people make a verbal statement in the presence of other witnesses and they say, "Yes, I want to give this to the church," would that not be
I think the law has evolved a lot more than that.
Yeah.
I don't know back then, maybe that was good enough, but now it's really, the attest you have to attest to it in front of a witness in writing.
Yeah.
And then you put that will into probate. I mean, there's all kinds of things to protect.
Yeah.
You know.
And I'm not saying that
intentions.
this isn't prophetic. I'm just saying I don't
Yeah,
quite buy Dempsey's argument that maybe there are better examples than
Yeah.
this particular one.
the growth part to me is that he recognized it should be surplus.
Yeah.
Because you can't say to people, we
Everything.
got it, I'm sorry, if you're gonna leave the church, then you've got nothing, you know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the growth in him,
Mhm.
you know.
Well, wouldn't that make us work cult status, but
I was gonna say that's why people think that.
we're a cult?
Well, it's interesting that,
Not
you know,
pulled up.
for many years, from the 1920s until the 1990s or whenever it was changed, I mean, the law of tithing kind of matched that.
Yeah.
That, you know, this, you know, your surplus is what you tithe for,
Yeah.
not the basic needs of life. And that was always in conflict with, I thought, with what the Bible said of tithing is 10% of what you got.
Yeah.
I mean, that was pretty clear.
And
but
the
we had
Mormons
a
went
diff-
back to 10% of
Yeah,
what you
the
got.
Mormons, yeah.
So that's interesting too.
Yeah.
to me.
I always thought that our law of tithing was much better because it taught you to manage.
Mhm.
You keep track of expenses,
Mhm.
you know what your surplus is. It forces you to be a good manager.
Yeah. Yeah, there were definitely benefits to
So what is it today?
10%. Well, it's, so for a
your
while
surplus?
it was 10% of your,
Increase.
not of your, well, for a long time, it was 10% of your increase. That's
Yeah.
kind of like surplus in
Right.
my mind. And then it went to 10%, but you could, all charitable organizations could be considered tithing. And then I
Okay.
think they backed off of
Oh.
that. Now it's, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Now-
I kind of understand that.
And now it's, I think, you know, they want tithing to be given to the church, not necessarily to
All organizations.
all
Okay.
organizations.
Yeah,
and
because I know it's changed a lot in the
it
years
has
that I've been
changed in the
out.
last couple of decades.
I mean, there's not a lot of
That's a little bit.
Confused.
What was that?
I said now it's kind of just do whatever.
Yeah, I think so. But you know, I know if you go online, we pay our tithing online now, and
Yeah.
all of the choices are church related. It's
Yeah.
not that you can give your money to the Red Cross or
All these.
Yes.
Probably fun of his suggestion. I like that. He made fun of my shoes.
Well, you know, they want you to be generous and it's like, okay, so I just finished paying off a huge debt at my ex. And so, you know, I was always trying to manage how much I gave to the church, how much would.
So we're about out of time here. So this is Dempsey's understanding of how a prophet grows. He says, prophets may have vague stirrings in the right direction, but may misinterpret parts of the experience. And the prophet gets sharper focus on the problem and thus refines their understanding to meet the needs of the people. And then finally, the prophet arrives at a mature understanding and presents a statement which is both profitable at the time and which also has value for future generations. So I don't argue with his interpretation of prophetic growth. I think it is important that we remember that all prophets are people, individuals, and yeah, you know, with frailties and failures as well as successes, and you know, the ability to grow and to learn and to change one's mind. But I invite you to just kind of think about this in the coming week and see what you feel about it. I can remember when, what was his name before Steve Veazey?
Grant.
Grant McMurray. I spoke in the auditorium, and he was talking about the challenges of being a prophet and being a human, and not, you know, he was kind of admonishing people, don't expect things that shouldn't be expected of a human prophet. You know, we're still individuals and we still make mistakes and learn as we go. And I think that kind of ties into that pretty well. And then Dempsey says the mark of a prophet is not to present a perfected message, but to be nudged in the right direction by the wisdom of God. And you might consider how you feel about that. If you think a prophet should be infallible all of the time, or is it okay for a prophet to make mistakes and then come back and rethink it and repray about it, maybe change the approach? it's not, probably not something we think about a whole lot.
No, I think that in our church, we kind of use the conference as a way of like, is this still working for us? Is this something we change? And I would assume that it comes from the prophet going, hey, you know, things have changed over the years, maybe we should relook at this. So I think that if we're not changing, we're not adapting, then we're gonna die out.
Well, I think, you know, we've gone in the direction now of recognizing the prophetic value of each voice of each person. And then that's healthy in a lot of ways. Not only does it share the responsibility for the mission of the church with all of the church, but I think it helps us to understand the prophetic struggle a little bit more clearly that our leaders have been going through since Joseph Smith. This has not been an easy job, and certainly it wears and tears on them, I'm sure.
Yeah, that I was just gonna say that 2013 document they created, a Faithful Disagreement, that's exactly what I recognize. And when they're actually teaching us, that's what our prophet and his people have been doing for years.
Yeah, that's what's been going on in
here's
the
the
closed
process.
chambers that we didn't know
Yeah.
about. Now we're
So now it
be
kind of
part of
brought
it.
us in.
Yeah.
I feel like we kind of got brought into the process more.
So I'm gonna have to stop there. We still have with Joseph
Isaiah.
Smith Jr. like Isaiah, who's teaching next week? What are you doing next week? What's that?
Chapter 19.
Chapter 19. If you would like me to finish this up, I've just got a few more slides. I can do that or save it for another time.